Thank you for joining us. And I'm Sheridan Orr, and I am the Chief Marketing Officer here at Built In. And if you don't know Built In, we are a technology recruiting platform, and we really help recruiters find in-demand tech talent. And many of you know that has become increasingly hard. And so I'm super excited about our guest today. Just a quick housekeeping note before we get involved. Please feel free to use the chat. We want to make this as interactive as possible and try to incorporate your questions as we go along. And we'll also be recording this webinar. If you would love to hear it again, maybe put it on repeat for your morning walk. You can just never get enough of our guests today. And so today, what I'm really excited about is a topic that many of us have been thinking about a lot, especially as more news hits us about the Great Resignation. But how do you retain your remote workforce and make sure they stay engaged and connected to the company in a really meaningful way? So I think a few of the topics that we're going to tackle today are burnout. And we're also going to talk a little bit about wellness. I know that's been top of mind for many of you, and certainly it is for us at Built In. And then we want to talk about how do you create a compelling culture and employer value proposition for today's remote worker. And we've almost got a class of workers who have been hired and onboarded fully under the COVID umbrella, and we just want to see how other companies are making sure those employees are successful. Again, this is about Built In. We have almost 2.7 million tech professionals that visit our site every month, and I'll share a little data as we go through about what we're seeing and how they're acting, and if there's anything that we can glean to apply to our remote workers. So I'd love to introduce our guest today, who is Dr. Brett Wells, and he is the Director of People and Analytics at Perceptyx. If you don't know Perceptyx, they just have a wealth of data about employees, employee engagement, just an enormous amount of information, and they work with a lot of top companies. So I'm super excited to hear Brett's thoughts and what they're seeing in the marketplace too. Brett, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks for having me today. And for all the new friends out there that haven't heard of Perceptyx yet, we've been around for going on about 20 years. We're headquartered in Temecula, California, but we have over 400 colleagues spread all around the world. I sit in our Lincoln, Nebraska office of all places. Let me know in the comments if you've been to Lincoln, Nebraska. And we solely focus on employee engagement and people analytics. So as an example, we work with over 30% of the Fortune 100, and we get all of that data in, we analyze it, look at trends, provide insights not only to our clients, but the market in general. And to give you a sense of the database that myself and my team have access to, it's over 15 million responses. So people where they share their insights about their employee experience, the barriers that are getting in the way of being engaged, how is that changing over time? And what I tell people is there's been no better time, except over the last 18 months, to be a social scientist, where we're studying all of these interesting effects, where we have the mass migration to working at home, how many people want to stay there. We had election, civil unrest. The list goes on in terms of the curveballs that were thrown at us during the pandemic. And there's no better way to try to navigate and see the way forward than to look at some data and use that best practice, evidence-based, to inform your decision making, to make smarter decisions.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm really excited to get started. So as you alluded to, it's been almost more than a year now of fear and uncertainty. And, some of us have handled it better than others. I think my first couple of months, I was in my pajamas watching Tiger King and, I don't know, maybe being a news junkie. But, leaders have had to work with we've just had to really dig deep into the empathy well. And, some of us are more equipped to do that than others. And, how do you really show that to an employee who may be remote? How do you show them that you care? And what do employees value the most about that?
Yeah, there's no better way to show you care than to listen. I think the first step is listening, and being an active listener, asking a lot of questions, and then taking all of that insight and doing something about it, taking an action to make that employee's life a little bit easier. As an example, my leader is incredibly flexible, and with I have a young son. You can see all the photos of us golfing together in the background. When times were in the beginning of the pandemic, he was learning at home, and I had to juggle a lot of roles, whether it was being dad, teacher, being an employee all at the same time, and being a short order cook for my son and making a countless number of grilled cheeses. It was great to have someone who listened to the struggles that I was facing as a working father and who was incredibly flexible. And that flexibility has continued throughout the pandemic now that he's back in school. And that's what I think most employees and what we're looking for are really asking for. If there's really one inoculation effect to all this negativity that's going on in the world, it's been the relationship with one's direct manager. And that has really been the glue to hold employees to the organization. And having an empathetic leader who is not only sympathetic by asking the questions, but is empathetic by changing their own actions and tailoring their approach to each employee is certainly, I think, one of the strongest ways to retain talent right now.
So the old adage, people don't leave companies, they leave managers, holds true even in unprecedented times.
Yeah, that's certainly a contributing factor is relationship with managers. And by no means is it the only thing that retains employees, but it's certainly one of those hygienic factors that everyone's looking for.
I think most of us would agree with you on that. Have you seen, look, let's just be honest. And I know we have a lot of people who have been HR practitioners for a long time on the call. Not all managers are really equipped to do that, as well as some. How do we make sure that our managers understand the importance of listening? Have you seen any trends there?
Yeah, well, I can talk about like some real world evidence. And during the pandemic, many organizations and leaders came to a crossroads in the woods, and they went one of two directions. And one of those directions is they played the ostrich game. They buried their head in the sand and just kept going on with their day. And they didn't ask employees questions. They didn't respond quickly. And then organizations that tend to thrive during the pandemic and all the curveballs that have been thrown are those that continue to ask questions and respond effectively. So as an example, we looked at organizations who had a history of running engagement surveys. Many of them paused, and all the good rationale: our employees are burned out, they're working hard, we already know how they feel, why make matters worse, why ask? And we saw that all of their metrics continued to decline over the pandemic when focusing over 1,000 organizations. So they were the least likely to be meeting their financial goals. They struggled to engage and retain their talent. On the flip side, those organizations who asked questions routinely and importantly acted on it, their outcomes, they were more than twice as likely to achieve those outcomes: financial performance, engaging, retaining talent. So there's many things at an organizational level that they can put into practice that really empower leaders to leverage that data. And one of those is having a listening program where leaders are active in that tool, understanding the sentiment of their employees and creating action plans to remove those barriers that are getting in the way for their teams.
That's so important. Now we've all been home for quite a bit, and a lot of studies show, hey, productivity is, if not better, it's certainly on par. But one place that we've seen kind of erosion has been on the commitment to the company, or sometimes that's measured as engagement. And and people just don't feel as loyal and have a higher likelihood to leave. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, I think we're in the eye of the storm. And why I say that, if we look at last year, a lot of employees, about 3 out of every 5 employees had some kind of disruption. So they changed jobs, they changed careers, they had a manager change. And when looking this year, 1 in 4 intend to leave their current employer. And we've already seen really heightened data with exit data that's provided by Bureau of Labor Statistics. We've had the highest exit rate in the last 20 years. And what we look at in the sentiment data during the pandemic, when times were tough and there were furloughs and layoffs, employees grasped on to the stability of what they had, and they weren't looking to move. And now with the economy bouncing back, that floodgate is now open again, and we're seeing people leave in mass exodus. Also, during the pandemic, we saw that many employees decided to learn new skills. And in addition to learning how to make pickles or sourdough bread or all those other things that we see on like TikTok videos, we also saw that in large part, they're learning heavy technology related skills, as they're seeing those industries were the least disruptive. So as one example, when we look at manufacturing, 2 in 5 learned a new skill, and over half of them that were learning that new skill, it was very technology heavy related skills. So they focused on acquiring computer programming, IT skills, and the like, to make themselves almost COVID recession proof in the future.
That's great. I mean, and we're actually seeing a lot of companies decide, hey, we want to start an apprenticeship program to nurture those that may be willing to try out a new skill that maybe they acquired during the pandemic. One of the biggest, benchmarks in an employee experience really is their onboarding experience. Like, if you do that well, they feel part of the fold and can really feel successful early on. Have you seen any trends on how we can onboard these remote employees better and make them feel connected, not just to the company, but also, to our mission, values, et cetera?
Yeah, good question. And I always love seeing effects in our data that we didn't anticipate to see. And one of those effects is what we've coined this COVID cohort. So you looked at all employees who onboarded during COVID-19, and we looked at what's unique about their experience compared to those who just joined prior to the pandemic. And the effect that I was anticipating, that we are all anticipating, is something known as the honeymoon effect. So when we look at engagement data, it's always, I say always, those employees who just joined, who are looking through their work world through rose-colored glasses, that are the most engaged. They are emotionally committed to the organization. They don't see any wrong in the organization. And we tend to discount their responses a little bit more and just wait a little longer and see how they really feel. And looking at all of the onboarding data for during COVID-19, they looked far more like they've been in the job for 3 to 5 years. They never had a honeymoon period. It was jump in, hit the ground running kind of attitude. And although we saw strong ties to their manager, where we really saw dips were in the more fringe relationships. So they didn't have a strong connection to their team, and they certainly didn't have strong relationships or connections cross-departmentally, where during the pandemic, if you're working remotely, it was very siloed. And even if you were working in a physical location, a physical workplace, if you're an essential worker, you were still very much siloed. Your breaks didn't look the same anymore. It's not like everyone was sitting together in the break room, eating a meal or hanging out on breaks together. So those relationships we saw take a huge dip. And to your point, that emotional commitment to the organization, they're the least likely to intend to want to stay at the organization for the next 12 months. So you're likely going to have a revolving door with your newly joined employees during COVID-19.
Did you see any outliers, any companies that were just like, hold on, wait, what were they doing? And it's because it was wildly different, or was that really across the board?
Yeah, there certainly are those organizations that are doing it well, and they've put time and attention onto rethinking onboarding experience and almost having these journey maps for people. So like one organization we work with actually did more of a design thinking approach for onboarding remotely. What's a day in the life look like for that individual? And knowing that there's these gaps in relationships, how do we bridge that for them? And by no means does it look as good as it was when it was in person, but it helped mitigate some of those effects that we're seeing in the data.
That's super interesting. If you are doing anything really creative to make sure your new employees as they onboard are connecting outside of just maybe their really tight working group, I'd love to see it in the chat. I think we all could definitely learn from each other there. And I love the idea of doing a journey map and kind of even doing like an emotional map of like, where is the stress going to come from? And like, where am I going to get those dopamine hits? Where am I going to feel good? So another thing that we're all struggling with, because, you know, we hear things like this, our remote employees that onboard remotely are not as connected to us. And I know that executives feel that. And so they cannot wait to get us all back into the office. And you referenced my favorite platform for market research in the whole wide world, which is TikTok. And I see a ton of people saying, I'm never going back into the office. I have gotten used to this. You know, have you at Perceptics, or when you're talking to the companies that you work with, like, what are you seeing in the return to work space and any trends there, and certainly any data that you have to help us make better decisions?
Yeah, about 2 in 3 people want some flexibility after COVID-19. So they can choose when, how, where they work. And I like to think of it, you know, for the longest time, all we've ever tasted was vanilla ice cream, and that's working in the physical office. That's all we knew. And maybe if you're on your deathbed, just maybe your manager would let you remote in for that one day. But that's the world we knew it. And then all of a sudden we tasted chocolate ice cream working from home, and we saw that we could make it work. And now after COVID-19, people don't want to go back to vanilla. They want chocolate or they want twist. Very few want that vanilla ice cream. And what I think is interesting though is some people are willing, the majority are willing to go back to the office if it means a progression in their career, a promotion. So 7 in 10 employees say that they would accept a promotion if it meant they had to go back to the office. So they're not saying no indefinitely, they're saying no for their current role. What I think is also interesting, many, about 5 in 10, about half of us, would take a small 3 to 5% pay cut if it meant they could work remotely indefinitely. What's I think is a little interesting also is, despite this resounding employee sentiment that we want flexibility, very few organizations are willing to meet that flexibility that organizations want. So when we look at all the available job posting data, less than 8% of all job postings are classified as remote friendly. So despite all of us wanting it, very few of the available jobs out there are actually offering it. And thinking of technology roles in particular, one role that comes to my mind that I think we've learned that could do just as effectively remotely, maybe except for some team meetings, collaboration, innovation, is software development. And less than 1 in 5 of software development roles are remote friendly. So despite employees wanting it, many organizations aren't offering it right now.
Great, and you certainly sparked some interest because we have quite a few audience questions to go to that. First of all, and this is definitely in your wheelhouse, when you think about like, how do you, what are the key factors that you've seen in maintaining and measuring a remote culture? And are they different from what we measured before?
You know, it's the same measurement sticks and the same barriers that tend to get in the way, whether it's collaboration, relationship with managers, communication, trust and leadership. Like the same cast of characters come up. What might be different, however, is the ordering of those in terms of importance. And it's what the great thing of asking these questions in mask is you can segment and start looking at, for this population, what's really driving retention, or what's driving engagement. And it might be very different than those who are in the physical office, or it might be very different by those by certain roles, like what your software developers want versus others. So you really can't take a one size fits all strategy to really improve the employee experience. It has to be far more individualized and thinking about those personas.
Yeah, one of the ones that I have always followed is trust in leadership and the importance of that on the employee experience and engagement. You know, that is something I think is harder to build remotely because they get to see you on a massive WebEx with everybody. They don't get to see you regularly. Is that one of the metrics that you've seen take a big hit? Probably, and certainly leadership has been grappling with unprecedented decisions.
Yeah, you know, I think for many of our clients that we work with, we saw the exact opposite, where it's gone up. Now we're working with organizations that get it, right? That understand the importance of the employee experience. So I wouldn't cascade these effects to everybody, but many of those leaders communicated more and more often by doing town halls and leveraging insights from the data that we help collect to show that path forward. And there's really no better way to demonstrate, again, that you care, have that empathy, than ask questions and then respond using the information you've gathered to chart the path forward. As one example, one of our clients that we work with, they are returning to the office. And but before crafting any kind of strategy, one important piece was missing, and that was the voice of employees. So what they did is crafted a unique survey experience, administered it to well over 10,000 of their employees, and understood by these different personas what are the barriers that are getting in the way. And often, because the pandemic, we had to move in an agile fashion, leaders made decisions, and they didn't pause to get the data, the right data, before making that decision. This organization did that, and many leaders thought, like one thing that stands out in my mind, they thought at the leadership level that they needed to redo their entire HVAC system, and that would cost tens of millions of dollars for this organization. Employees ranked that dead last in terms of making them feel safe and wanting to return to the workplace. So instead, they took that money that they were going to invest in HVAC and air conditioning and ventilation, and instead put it into tools that'll help with staggered scheduling and creating more barriers in the workplace and requiring masks, or how do we physically distance. So it's better to ask the questions and get the data than to just go with the hunch and make the wrong decision and cost tens of millions of dollars in that case.
It's so important. And Timothy just wanted us to reiterate the stat on how many would stay, take a pay cut to stay remote. And I think it was 3 to 5%.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, it's 5 in 10 employees would take a 3 to 5% pay cut. Gotcha. If it meant they could remain working remotely.
Yeah, and it's funny because we were just doing a roundtable with a bunch of technology leaders from, Fortune 100 companies. And one of the things that they were saying is actually finding some remote talent is becoming harder because there's just zero unemployment in technology, and that salaries are actually rising everywhere. And so employees aren't even having to take that cut. So perfect. Thank you so much for putting that in there.
One thing I would just add on that I think is unique to technology, if you look traditionally where many of big tech is located, you think of like the Bay Area, which the cost of living is tremendously high. What's going to be an interesting decision point is they flatten the work experience and you can work from anywhere and be remote, is what are they going to do in terms of paying people that live in Lincoln, Nebraska? Are they going to pay more like headquarters pay, more like relative to the local market? what's going to be that decision point? How are they going to make it equitable and fair? Thinking of those differences. So they're going to be able to attract a world of talent, and talent acquisition is going to be even more choking on applications than they already are for those organizations. But the pay is going to be an interesting consideration.
Yeah, it's funny because I think Amelia and both Annie bring up different points because they've heard the opposite stat and that geo pay may be assessed. And I really think that this is going to end up being role-based and location-based. And I think there's going to be a formula there. At least that's what we're seeing in our data and the work that we do with a lot of our customers. So great points. And I'm going to get to the question about making job descriptions more remote friendly in a second, because I think Brett has a great point on officeism. And, as we have, now eventually we're going to go back to some sort of hybrid, most of us. And how do you make sure like employees that are going to remain remote because they've been hired as a remote employee are not aren't missing out on those promotions or the engagement or, the line of sight of leaders?
Yeah, so officeism, real quick, let's just define that. And what, in my mind, what we've kind of stumbled on in data and across our clients is that there's this pervasive belief. Over 7 out of 10 employees believe that employees who continue to work remotely are going to be backed into the corner. So they're going to have worse relationships with their managers and teams. They're going to have fewer opportunities for career development, growth, mobility, and they're going to be less productive. Now that in and of itself paints a pretty negative picture of those individuals who want the flexibility and the benefits that are going to be afforded to them. Despite all the evidence that you've already mentioned about how they're just as productive, they can be just as engaged, all of the like. When we start looking at which groups might be impacted most, one of the groups that gives me a lot of heartburn is working mothers. That group in particular has changed their return to work preferences. Over 75% of them have changed how they felt one way or another over the course of the pandemic. Compared to their male counterparts, they're more likely to want to have that flexibility. And for those who want to have a hybrid arrangement, working mothers will spend about 1 day less a week on average in the physical workplace than their male counterparts. So you're going to see offices have a little bit more predominantly male flavor, and with these pervasive attitudes and career development happening at the water cooler, so to speak, as opposed to always thinking about those remote employees, you're going to see that glass ceiling that we've been trying to chip away at for dozens of years all of a sudden resurface stronger than it has been. So in terms of what I think organizations really need to do is make sure they're creating an equitable experience for remote versus in-person. You should be looking at hiring rates, promotion rates, engagement data, and trying to make them as equitable as possible. And if it's something you're not tracking, that should be something you are. And I think the more progressive organizations have even instituted someone who's responsible for the remote experience, the remote employee experience, where that's their sole focus, is thinking of those journey maps, looking at data, thinking about the unique barriers for that group. How do we keep them more connected to the organization when they're not physically there? So that's going to be a real struggle, and certainly some of those groups that give me concern.
Yeah, and I had just been looking at some US Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and they were talking about 4 million people had decided that they just, even though they were still of working age, I'm just not going back. And a large proportion of these were millennial mothers, and they just had decided, I cannot be teacher, mother, employee all at once. Is there anything that you've seen really progressive companies that you work with doing to address that?
Yeah, thinking about that she session in particular, seeing that mass exodus of women even all the way up into executive levels in terms of that exodus. Many organizations are instituting like a returnship. So let's ease employees back into the workplace where it's not that, if it's 40 hours a week, I'd be surprised, but where it's far less than that commitment. Where you're working, you can still have that flexibility. Let's do 10 to 20 hours and amp up over time, and then maybe go to a full offer, as opposed to jumping right back on the treadmill or the hamster wheel that's spinning so fast.
Great. As you think about the difference between in-office and remote employees, Dustin would love to know, what are some of the tips to avoid or mitigate that have not a situation with the remote employees versus the in-office employees? And I think you said one, like we just need to keep an eye on, are we being equitable in promotions and new opportunities?
Yeah, what I would say is we have the three buckets where we see the sentiment be pervasive, and that's on productivity, relationships, and career opportunities. And I think you could get at some data points on each of those areas and bust some myths. So one thing is like going against officeism and saying that should be false, just like any other kind of discrimination. We shouldn't support that. So let's find some data that it's not the case in our organization. Remote employees are just as productive when we look at these data. They can have just as strong relationships when we look at this. They can have just as strong career growth opportunities. So look for the data, and where it's not there, that's where you need to start thinking about improving that experience so you can make them nearly as equitable.
Great. And I do think just recognizing it is the first step.
Of course, yeah.
So the other thing is, like, what are you seeing that's really attractive to employees now versus maybe pre-pandemic? Have there been any changes that you've seen, whether it's benefits, working conditions?
Yeah, good question. So one thing we track is the employee value proposition. So when thinking about what makes an organization attractive, what's the value I gain as a potential employee from working there? There's a whole host of attributes you can look at. And what we do in some of our surveys is this methodology that we just internally call a tile and drill. So the tile, we list 30 attributes that are commonly associated with creating an attractive workplace. So maybe it's health benefits, compensation, work-life balance, the list goes on. And we ask employees, select the 5 that would make an organization most attractive to you. And then we follow that up with, now rate your current employer on how well they're meeting those 5 on each of those dimensions. So what you'd probably expect, many of the top ones have remained stable over the pandemic. So employees still place a great value, importance on things like health benefits and compensation, their retirement, pay for performance, vacation. But we've also seen some newer ones creep higher on the list in terms of importance. And those include things like company stability, the manager quality, their team quality and relationship, social responsibility, and remote friendly. And when I think of that list in particular, you can kind of create a case of what's happened over the last 18 to 24 months that have caused employees to put greater emphasis on that. You think of all the furloughs and layoffs, no wonder that company stability ranks higher on the list. You think of the murder of George Floyd and the ensuing events after, there's no surprise that things like social responsibility, diversity, equity, inclusion are more important than they were before. And then you think of the remote friendly, experiencing the remote world. And then again, thinking of the vanilla versus chocolate cone, many of us want to have chocolate or twist going forward. That remote friendly is ranking higher on the list.
Yeah.
And why this matters, I would just say, is that it's a precursor to turnover and what's going to happen. So remember, in that tile and drill, we have them rate their current company. Are your benefits way below market, just below market, at market, above market, way above market? And when employees are unfavorable to all 5 of those top things, only about half intend to stay at that company for the next 12 months. That's huge turnover. You're going to lose half of those people. And then if we look at organizations that are knocking it out of the park and their employees that are on average 5 out of 5 are meeting those needs, 96% retention. And it's a nice linear progression in between. So if you really need to, the bottom line is you need to pay attention to what your employees and even prospective employees value. And then you need to rethink kind of the unique algorithm in terms of what you're offering, how you're marketing it to the world to make it a destination of choice to be an employer. And then again, segment by different employee populations. Your developers might want something entirely different than your accounting professionals. So understand what's unique. Think of the roles that are critical for your business, that are difficult to source, attract, retain. And I would focus on the unique EVP for them and work towards moving the needle in some of those areas to really mitigate that great resignation.
That's so interesting. And one of the things that we're actually seeing, so if you know Built In, employers put up their profile and they kind of link their benefits. And we also have a way for our tech users to search for companies based on benefits that are really important to them. And we're starting to see a big shift. Like pre-pandemic, it was a lot of this in-office stuff, like friends at work, eat lunch together, you know, those types of things. What we're seeing now, it's quality of life types of benefits. We're seeing the sabbatical become very important, that people want to take extended periods of time off. We're seeing that the unlimited PTO candidates want a specific number that is appropriate at your company versus, hey, it's unlimited and I feel guilty about taking any of it. So those types of things, obviously wellness benefits. And then the other thing that we're seeing emerge are kind of the cafeteria style benefits that are, you have a certain bucket of dollars and you can use these for things like, you know, home cleaning and things that could alleviate some of the stress off of those working mothers types. So very, very interesting. I'm so glad to have your data. I have another question. For those who were hired remotely and indefinitely will not return to the office, you know, the office location is just actually not there. What are some tips to keep them engaged, especially those new hires? Have you seen anything really amazing?
Yeah, it's, you know, one of the things that I've seen is trying to replicate some of those natural effects that occur during normal onboarding or onboarding in person, where you go through it as a cohort. So creating an onboarding cohort, creating those ties to individuals within the department and cross department, having mentors, having an onboarding buddy, things like that have gone a long way to, again, build that network that happens more naturally when you're physically co-located as opposed to being remote. So those are just a couple of things that we've seen. Like some organizations that I know of will onboard remote employees like the same day of the week. So they're all onboarded together as opposed to like cascading that out and having new people onboarding every day. So they create more of this cohort effect where they're going through it together. They're having breakout sessions, leveraging the technologies like Zoom and breakouts and things like that to try to have it resemble more like it was in person.
Great. And Bill, I just could thank you so much for asking this question. It's a little unknown right now because many companies are still grappling with how to execute this with OSHA requirements having not come in. But how is the potential for mandated vaccines affecting employee populations or the inclination to stay or leave companies and how they're approaching this issue? Have you seen anything in your data on that yet?
Yeah, we have seen a good proportion of employees who said that they would consider leaving their organization if vaccines were required. And interestingly enough, when it was a little earlier in the pandemic and the vaccines were just coming out, it was essential workers who were actually more likely to believe that. And when looking at some of their comment data and linking it to the responses, the theme that reoccurred was, we're in harm's way every day. We've managed to mitigate it, don't require it. Like, we're already taking measures to remain safe. What I have seen in some clients who have implemented the requirement, their actual turnover numbers pale in comparison to what they were expecting just based on employee sentiment. So employees were talking a big game in terms of exodus, but it didn't happen. So, but now granted, that's just a couple of cases. But with the new mandate, everyone who has over 100 employees, if I'm not mistaken, might be pushed into that regardless of what they feel. So if anything, I actually like that, because the organization isn't the bad guy. Instead, it's big government, and people will stay at the company unless they're going to go work for an organization that has fewer than 100 employees.
Yeah, I saw, and United Airlines had done this really early, even before the government decided that they were going to mandate it. And I think that it was the headlines, maybe in the New York Times today, that only 563 of their employees have not yet complied. And some of those, you know, are in different situations. But I mean, that's out of what, 100,000 employees-ish. So I think you're totally right. And I love, Elizabeth, the assigning buddies. Have you seen ERGs have an impact on maybe making sure the employees stay connected early on? Have you seen any of that?
You know, I could certainly see connect the dots there to it, but it's not something that I've looked at personally or could really speak about, but I could see how that would make a big difference.
Yeah, we definitely see that candidates and tech professionals are really looking for companies that have ERGs that support things like working mothers, certainly diversity, equity, and inclusion type groups. Any other questions before we leave you with some parting words? This has been a great discussion so far, and thank you to our audience for really great questions.
As those are coming in, I would say another interesting fact that we have on the vaccination, with many organizations wanting to return to the office, it's good to look at the employee sentiment around being around those who are either vaccinated or unvaccinated. And 3 in 4 employees feel at least some stress or anxiety when near unvaccinated coworkers. So thinking of putting the minds of the masses more at ease than that small percentage of holdout employees that are not going to get vaccinated, there's a lot of data pushing in that other direction, that it's not going to be as bad as you think. People aren't going to walk out the doors.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Elizabeth. I think you already have some fans now, Brett. They're really excited to your data. And I know that Perceptics very frequently publishes trends in the industry and some work of their other people doing research with companies. So they're a great follow. And obviously Brett is very interesting himself. Thank you so much for your time. Anything that you would like to leave, last parting words, leave our audience with?
You know, I'll just say that stay tuned for even more insights. We're continuously looking at this data, and it's been a dream for a social researcher to look at these things. I wish it was under different circumstances, but we're trying to provide as many insights as possible, and you can go on our website and look at our resource library. We also have research partnership with Josh Burson and his academy. So if you want to look at what's the secret success to being resilient during COVID-19, or what's the new employee experience or talent acquisition, we have those papers as well linked on our website.
Well, thank you so much. And I would love if you all would complete the survey, because we want to bring you more interesting topics that are going to help you as you navigate, as we keep saying, unprecedented times. We'll send you the recording if you'd like. And The other thing is we're getting ready to launch our nominations for best places to work, and we'll send you information on that webinar coming soon. And we have been so fortunate to launch a new podcast called Technically People, and we talk to thought leaders like our friend Brett here on that podcast. So please subscribe, and if you or anybody in your company you think would be an interesting guest, we would love to hear from you. I hope you all have a great day, and we'll give you 10 minutes back to go have a little time. So it's our pleasure to be with you. And thanks, Brett. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks. I hope to be back soon.
Anytime, my friend, anytime.